Hi, I'm Netta Spencer. Today, it's time for us to give a little talk about money, a little thought about the money, because we've been talking in our last series of shows, the most current series of shows, we're mostly talking about the challenges of developing new technologies for climate repair. And I think especially I'm concerned mainly with the Canadian Arctic, or actually both poles, because that's where we have the most urgent need to control the climate or get it back into shape. So we've been focusing on technological things, and which is exactly right, I think. But at the same time, I think we ought to give some thought to the whole economics of the thing, because the main reason we are having so much trouble getting rid of greenhouse gases is that it's expensive to make this kind of shift. And so let's talk at length about the way in which we can facilitate, motivate people to make some changes in the way we use energy. I have three fellows with me who know a lot about economics and a lot about climate. And the combination is exactly the thing that we want to pay attention to. And they don't know each other yet, but they're all going to get acquainted. I will start with in the order in which they appeared on my screen, saying hello. I think in California is Arthur Edelstein. Is that right, Arthur?
Yes, yeah,
You're around Irvine or
yes,
someplace. Mm-hmm.
yeah, exactly. Yep.
Yeah, okay. And when I first met Arthur, he was a graduate student doing a doctoral dissertation on the human brain or something, if I'm not mistaken. And
Not on,
he,
not on the brain, but in biophysics.
well, at any rate, it was a big shift. So you're doing other things, mostly about computers, I think, and
Yes.
the internet. Good. And Ron Bauman, I don't know where you are. Are you in Indiana?
It's Ron Bayman. I was outside of Chicago at the Benedictine University, and I am now retired and living next to my son and grandson in Columbus, Ohio.
I see. Okay. And you are a retired economics professor, right?
Correct.
And that's great. I won't try to list all the credentials of you distinguished folks, because everybody will probably already know who you are. And much closer to home for me is Mark Winfield, who is a professor at York University. I've known Mark a little bit for a number of years, and it's a pleasure always, because he knows his stuff when it comes to to energy, and the economics of energy is the thing that we want to talk about mostly today. Now, I don't know much. I'm to be honest, to my great shame, I never had an economics course in my whole life, and I'm very remorseful about having ignored such an important part of. As a sociologist, it's pretty stupid to not not know anything about economics, but that's the reality. So you guys are going to have to do all the heavy lifting today, but I'm sure you can interact and feel very free to interrupt each other and disagree if you do, or whatever comes up in your discussion about carbon pricing. And Ron Raymond is going to give us a short introduction. He says he has some slides, and I suggest then that you just show us what you got, and then we'll go from there. And everybody can you feel free to kind of mix it up, because I'm not going to be much of a coordinator or moderator on a conversation of this nature, even though I know we all need it. So Ron, go for it.
Thank you, Meta, and thank you very much for inviting me to share in this conversation. I hope will be really helpful for everyone, for all of us. Here are my slides. So let's go on with the topic at hand, which is carbon pricing. I did want to say, and I will say in this first slide, that I am part of a group called the Healthy Planet Action Coalition, HPAC, And we have been working, we've done, presentations, all kinds of things on our website, which is healthyplanetaction.org. But most recently, we resubmitted a paper after initial review to the Oxford Open Climate Change, addressing the urgent need for direct climate cooling rationale and options. And so my basic position, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but is that we really have to engage in direct climate cooling at this point, and no amount of greenhouse gas reduction or drawdown realistically that can be obtained realistically is going to moderate and certainly not reverse the increasingly severe climate impacts that we're seeing for the next few decades at least.
Well,
Until
look
we
here,
can.
I'm right off the bat, I'm in total agreement with you, and I'll be curious to know. I presume that both of the other guys feel the same way. But if you just questioned what Ron said, this would be a moment to say that no, you disagree. How do you feel about this, fellas?
I just have a definitional question of what do you mean by direct climate cooling?
So direct climate cooling, it's commonly referred to as climate intervention or geoengineering.
Right.
And we have a broader definition because it includes thermal radiation management as well as solar radiation management. So we use a more inclusive term. And that's all discussed in the paper. Thank you, though. Yeah,
Yeah,
good
onward.
question.
Thank you. Oh,
Yes.
Mark.
Yeah, no, well, that definition's helpful, but I have to say I'm not a huge fan of geoengineering. Depends on what it means, and but there are a lot of questions it gives rise to, but we'll leave that for later.
All right.
Okay, thank you, Mark. And getting directly, this, of course, of course, I'm sure you're all familiar, the 2023 and the beginning of 2024 is just off the charts warming.
Yes, no, you're going to need to explain that to me. In fact, I think we put that very chart into the current issue of Peace Magazine. Somebody, we always have a column about current controversies, and we did have a paper about that, and somebody put this up, but I had to have it explained to me. All this stuff down below is earlier periods of time. You really have to tell me what this whole thing means.
So these are a daily surface air temperature. So this is the global mean surface temperature that is used as the basis for the metric for climate warming. And as you can see, 1.5 was the previous target, 1.5 Celsius above pre-industrial, which is the average of 1850 to 1900. This is from
Wait a minute, hold on. This thing starts January to December. This would be for 1 year.
Right. So every year is overlaid. So these are, 1940s are the sort of the darker blue you get the earlier back in history. And so you can see in the early post-war period, we were pretty much at zero, the global average. I mean, we were above it already because we've already had a lot of greenhouse gas emissions and so forth. But as time goes on, now we're 2024, you can see that we're further and further above the pre-industrial surface temperature for the globe. And so you can see that particularly in 2023, it's just completely off the charts. I mean, it's a huge jump, and 2024 seems to have sort of continued that trend for a while anyway. And so we are facing a very, very severe situation here. This is breaking through all the the thresholds that the IPCC has agreed upon earlier, and then they changed it to 2, but we've even passed 2 degrees Celsius at one point in February 2024. So it's a very concerning picture of how immediate and urgent the situation is. Okay, so the next one, so I go right into having sort of stated my view that we need direct climate cooling, and now I'm trying to explain why. So the reason is that as the pace of social change, of political and economic change, particularly on a global scale, is very slow. It has always been slow. And so, it is simply unrealistic. I mean, we fully support every effort, to ramp up, increase, do whatever we can to cut emissions and to draw down greenhouse gas. But realistically, we are not going to be able to do that at a rapid enough pace to avert these increasing climate calamities. The basic point is that, for developing countries that are particularly dependent on foreign currency, and they get their foreign currency from oil exports, this, it would take 4 trillion basically to just subsidize the revenue that they're earning right now to offset critical, foreign currency that they're getting from this. So we need a mandatory regime. And to date, about 300 billion was transferred from rich countries to poor countries via the Clean Development Mechanism, which was part of the Kyoto Protocol. Well, the point is that the green, they call it the Green Climate Fund, has been so far, I think, raised about 18 million. They were shooting, or is it 8? Yeah, and they 18 billion maybe. They were shooting for 100. I have the figures on the slide. So, but it's much too little, even if they succeeded to offset even just the direct subsidies. We're not counting, all the economic development and the increased energy that the developing countries need to grow and to develop. So it's just, this is part of what's needed to have a realistically rapid transition to green energy. You really need massive transfer of wealth and technology to countries that right now, their populations are living at, in very deprived circumstances, and they need those
now
to
here we've
develop.
got two different things going on. One is trying to set standards for equity among countries of the world and the people of the world. The other, when we hear in Canada about global carbon pricing, we're mostly talking about whether or not the Canadian government or one of the provinces is going to dig in their heels and say, we will not have any more, we will not require taxes from the use of carbon. So I think there's a good chance, I don't know whether other guys will agree, but I have the impression that there's now a growing resistance to paying taxes in Canada that would, again, try to create motivation for people to cut back on their use of fuels, fossil fuels. And these are two different matters. Or are they? I mean, to talk about the domestic problem of carbon pricing, does that require, or is it logically intertwined with the question of how much we need to transfer money from rich countries to the poor?
Well, I assume you're sort of addressing this to me. Yes, I agree that just reinforces the point that social change is very difficult. It's very difficult. The U.S. is worse than Canada. I mean, the U.S. one of the major parties is absolutely in climate denial. So it's going to take a long time for this transition to occur, given, and without as I said, the international agreement basically collapsed. So now we have a kind of voluntary regime of national determined contributions, NDCs, and that's going much slower and with much less transfer. So you have the internal situation within the countries themselves of trying to achieve their own climate goals. And then on top of that, we have the much more critical situation, really, because the growth in emissions is really from the developing countries, particularly China and India and so forth, China especially. And that's where, we really need a rapid deployment of clean energy production. And it's not going to happen rapidly without a very, very large redistribution, basically,
Okay,
on
now
top of the problems that you're
we've got
talking
two
about.
different issues that we're talking about here. Now,
Right.
I don't know whether we can talk about both of them. One is the politics of taxation of carbon use in any one country. And especially I'm thinking about it in Canada because Mark and I are both in Canada, but it could be, you know, in the US or wherever. The other is the transfer of money, and I don't see that they're necessarily connected. Countries could subsidize other countries in other ways than by raising taxes on carbon in their own country. Which are we going to talk about today? Are we talking about carbon pricing? Or are we talking about equity in sharing the burden of the economics challenge itself? I'd like to hear both Art and Mark as to what your concerns are right now about what we need. Let's look at it this way. What do we most urgently need to attend to today? If the world depends on our taking some policy position today, what is it we need to work on first?
I was curious where Ron's argument was going, because it sounded like, I mean, you've set up a problem that sounds impossible to solve. So what's the what's the answer to, in your view?
Well, I mean, what I'm just trying to bolster the point that we need to have a Band-Aid. We need some way to keep things under control while we're working on this much more fundamental problem. And that's basically what I was saying, that, you know, this is why there's a mismatch between the you know, the natural process here. The climate change is happening much faster than global human evolution, social change, and that's the problem. And to deal with that mismatch, we need some way to apply a tourniquet to stop the bleeding, to try and just keep things manageable.
So, excuse me,
as we
your
work on the
argument
more
then
serious
really
problems.
is about the necessity of adopting geoengineering solutions, which is, you know, I was wondering where you were going with this. So that's really the point you're driving at. Okay, I will already concede that because I agree with you 100%. Matter of fact, the current issue of Peace Magazine contains a transcript of a conversation I had with the journalist Gwen Dyer, who has a new book called Intervention Earth, in which he spends his whole time trying to make that point, and convincingly, I think. So let's, if we go on past that, and let's get down to the business that we thought we were going to talk about, is how much we need to depend on carbon pricing as a mechanism to incentivize people to shift their uses of fuel. Mark, I'm sure you're sitting there. Go ahead. Tell me what you think about this issue.
I think you're muted, Mark.
Mark, are you muted or something? I'm not hearing you. You are muted. Okay.
On mute. Yeah, well, we should finish a little bit, you know, Ron's train of thought just before we move on, just, you know, to finish the thought, because I think where he's going is basically that the chances of effective mitigation measures in the reasonably short term is nil, and indeed there may be challenges distributionally around that, and that therefore you have to take the geoengineering approach as opposed to a mitigation approach to deal with the problem. Very briefly, I think that carries with it its own enormous governance problems in terms of how to manage that. A whole series of questions around impacts and the distributional effects of those impacts as well, which could be equally, if not more, politically difficult to manage. Say nothing of our actual, you know, the actual biophysical impacts going down that pathway as well. Given that we've made such a mess not trying to manage this, so I'm not entirely sure we'll do better actively trying to manage the problem. But on the carbon pricing question, the short answer is that it's not a magic bullet in terms of a mitigation strategy. I think it was in a Canadian context badly oversold. That we were told by certain economists that this is all we needed to do, and that this would solve the problem. And that at a level of $170 a ton or so, indeed by some estimates $300 a ton. There were many of us who had our doubts and would probably have argued that yes, you need carbon pricing, but alone it will not get you where you need to get to within the required timeframes. You need to use the full range of policy instruments available to governments. So law and regulation, fiscal measures, informational measures, everything is going to be needed. Carbon pricing is probably a necessary component, but not sufficient. We've now in Canada run up against this problem of, at least for consumer carbon pricing, because in Canada we have there's two components. There's an industrial carbon price, which would take longer than this session to try and explain, but and then there is a consumer price, which is basically a surcharge on fossil heating fuels and transportation fuels. And we may be at a point where we're hitting the limit of political acceptability for the fuel charge, which is sitting at about $80 a ton right now. So we've got a problem there, that we have a major opposition, the leading opposition party, running on a campaign called Axe the Tax. That's pretty clear. We have provinces who were previously very much, this was originally a federal provincial consensus 8 years ago. That consensus has collapsed. Really only British Columbia and Quebec remain engaged on carbon pricing. There is now head-on Fed-Prov conflicts, including litigation all the way to the Supreme Court.
I'd like to have you unpack that a little bit, because I don't fully understand what the objections are. I'm persuaded by this statement that, well, we're just taking the money away from you temporarily. We're giving it back to you. You'll get as much back as it really costs you. So what are you complaining about? That sounds good to me. Why isn't that convincing to the average consumer?
It takes more than 3 syllables to explain, is the short answer. Axe the tax is a lot easier. This notion, and Ralph Torrey wrote an interesting piece about this too, this complicated Rube Goldberg process by which you pay an upfront a surcharge effectively on heating fuels and transportation fuels. And then that comes back to you quarterly in a rebate, which in some cases, a lot of people's cases, if you have a direct deposit relationship with Canada Revenue Agency, it just appears in your bank account for no apparent reason. You don't even get a check in the mail saying, this is from Justin Trudeau, this is your carbon rebate.
I see.
So that's been a huge problem. That's what Mr. Poilievre, our principal opposition leader federally, is all over. It's a very populist, reduce costs in the immediate short term kind of politics. This is, an Ontario government that gets rid of automobile vehicle licensing fees because that makes it cheaper for you. It subsidizes electricity rates to the tune of $7 billion a year to make things more affordable. And that's money that comes out of healthcare and education. So that's the politics of the moment.
Basically what I think you're saying is it makes perfect sense, but people don't want to take the trouble to understand how it works.
And in a moment when political discourses are going down, not up, in terms of level of complication, I say, if it's more than 3 syllables, it's no good. My counter argument, depending on what happens this summer in central and northern Canada, may be, well, is the alternative let it burn, which is what we're facing. It'd be a very interesting political moment at the end of this summer if we end up with cities enveloped in wildfire smoke again, which have almost never had that experience in something. Toronto, the notion you'd go outside and you would smell smoke.
Well, then
was
look, when people
unbelievable.
actually look out the window and see a fire coming at them,
Yeah.
does this empirically, I mean, can you show that it makes any difference in the way they think about these issues? Are any of them developing a sense of emergency or of urgent desire to, do something this very minute? Or do they slough it off and say that's nature and let God take his have his way or something?
I don't think it's even that far. I mean, I can only speak about Canadian politics and where we are. We are in an age of deep simplification of political discourses, and people's perspectives are extremely short term. Gas prices went up too much last weekend, kind of thinking. Now that's a function of the impact, especially of inflation, especially in the current context, which is itself a function of these two huge exogenous events that have taken place. COVID, which pushed interest rates downwards dramatically, which is ultimately going, any economist will tell you, ultimately that's going to have an inflationary effect. And then we also have the war in Ukraine, which had this huge impact on food and energy supply chains. So that drove inflation. And that has then made people very sensitive to things which involve increased prices. And to be pushing a consumer carbon price in that context becomes, as Mr. Trudeau is discovering in Canada, is an enormously difficult thing to do. And that's the challenge he's faced with.
There's another dimension to it, or the opposite thing. I've been shocked to hear the numbers. I don't even want to cite them because I hardly dare believe it. The amount of money that is spent on subsidies to the fossil fuel interests, let's say, globally. And you can give a number on that, but I tell you what I heard was, I can't even wrap my mind around it. The amount that these companies are making from the subsidies that of various kinds. Surely the public, if they knew that big companies are making that kind of money from their consumption patterns, they might give it some further thought. What can you tie in this question of subsidies to the whole question of carbon taxation and the political attitude people have toward it? I'll take an answer from anybody who's got a good explanation of that.
I'll start and then I'll let the others guys, let the others have your time too. Well, fundamentally, subsidies are relatively hidden, and people aren't aware of the scale of, this fundamental problem is the carbon price is in your face. Our premier wanted to put stickers on the gas pumps so you could see explicitly how many cents a liter this was costing you. The subsidies are largely hidden. And they're buried deeply within the tax system. So people they don't necessarily make the connection that's, a lot of it's in the form of foregone tax revenue as opposed to an explicit, here's a bundle of cash. And so it's even more invisible. People it's a very complicated chain to say, well, we forwent $1 billion in revenues we would have got from the oil and gas industry that otherwise we could have spent on healthcare and education, but we didn't. Like, that's a long chain for people to connect with. And indeed, in Canada, I mean, we're in this somewhat shocking situation where we have just given a $34 billion gift to the fossil fuel industry in the form of the Trans Mountain Pipeline.
That pipeline, yeah.
Which is just horrifying. I mean, I don't know, I may talk myself into Ron's position at this rate. It's just horrifying. It's a giant fossil fuel export infrastructure, which is designed fundamentally to facilitate the export of the most carbon intensive fossil fuels on the planet from the Alberta oil sands. But people, I was listening to CBC this morning, and they weren't making that connection about the pipeline. They're worried about the orcas and the oil spills in the Salish Sea, which is a big deal. But the really big deal is this is about facilitating the expansion of production in the oil sands.
Mm.
And that's going to make achieving our carbon targets almost impossible. So I'll leave it there as my piece on subsidy. But that's the problem, is the subsidies are invisible. They're not
Well,
understood.
how can they
as
be made
foregone
more visible?
money.
I mean, if you were going out to do a publicity campaign to say, look, guys, look, public, look how your money is being spent, and look, what do you really want to be subsidizing these people? What would you point out? You'd certainly point out the Trans-Canada Pipeline. What else? I mean, where else is there? Where else do they get their gravy?
I agree with everything Mark is saying. I mean, I think all those things are absolutely, on point. The one thing, and I mean, the option, of course, if a carbon tax. I mean, most of the cap and trade programs in Europe as well, they're supplemented by carbon taxes on other sectors that aren't covered, for example. But of course, a tax is not enough. We need to supplement it by investment, by planning, by many other more direct kinds of efforts and sector-specific efforts to reduce emissions. The one point where I would push back a little bit is which was what I was trying to say, that the governance problem for geoengineering may in some ways be actually easier than the governance problem for global transformation of human industrial civilization. That, you could, instead of asking for perfect global governance, some kind of, pre-approval of any measure to directly cool the climate, you start gradually. In fact, we have the IMO bunker fuel restrictions that, according to Jim Hansen, have caused a 1 watt per square meter jump, and that's part of the reason for that huge jump in warming. That was a regulation by the IMO, which is an already existing international institution as part of the UN, and they could roll that back. They could say, okay, let's relax the regulations for the high seas, for example, just as a temporary measure, and then deploy other kinds of cooling like marine cloud brightening, et cetera, on ships to offset the sulfates from the fossil fuels when you transition to renewable energy. So there are things we could do right now that would have a significant global cooling impact that don't require enormous governance issue, a new sort of whole development of international government. But on the carbon taxing, absolutely. I mean, it's not a silver bullet. It needs to be complemented. I mean, the proof of the pudding, though, is that the EU continued with the Kyoto type protocol, and they're the only major region of the world that has significantly cut emissions. Now,
there's cap and trade, and then there's some other, I don't know what the title is for the alternative method of carbon pricing. It must have a title. But if I had, from the very get-go, when the 20 years ago talk about carbon pricing was in the discourse, I had my doubts about cap and trade. Looked to me like that was a way in which people could play the system and get credit for doing things that they probably would have done anyway, and or other ways of, it looked to me like I suspected that. Am I well founded in my misgivings about cap and trade as compared to, I don't know what else you call it, but direct carbon pricing?
Yes, there has been a lot of criticism of the offsets, of how, the gaming, as you say, the offsets, so that, I'm gonna grow a forest that would have grown anyway, or that sort of thing. The answer to that, I think, is it's interesting, from a radical economist, Albert Hanel, who was actually not a pro-market economist at all. He's quite the opposite. But he, on this particular issue, he said, you know, if you enforce that, if you made nations take national responsibility for these offsets, not leave it up to individual contracts. So the contracts would still be, they had a whole bureaucracy in Geneva, I think, or somewhere to you know, overview, regulate those contracts. But if you had nations held responsible for what their supposedly offsets were supposed to do in terms of reducing their emissions, that you could probably enforce now with the satellite data and so forth, you know, on a macro level, and to kind of hold them to that. Okay, you know, your contract said that you were going to offset this much emissions. We want to see those emissions offsetted. We don't care if the individual contracts are not working or whatever. So I think there are ways to deal with that, especially with modern, you know, satellite sensing and estimation techniques and so forth, that would give us a fairly good handle on, you know, to avoid that kind of gaming. So, you know, I really, you know, my position is, you know, given the existing evidence that the only major region of the world that's been able to actually achieve significant reductions has such a regime in place.
You're saying that Europe has an approach that has worked. What's special about the European approach that makes it?
Well, you know, I'm not an expert on what's going on in Europe, but I know from the data that you know, they have a cap and trade system in place. They adjust the price on an annual basis, I believe, to reach their target European emissions reduction goals. And
Well, is that all they do, or do they do?
No. They do all the other. Many of them have carbon taxes as well, and they also have all kinds of investment subsidies and other, you know,
So
regulations and
now
things to
my
supplement.
question is, what, you know, who gets the credit for any progress that are made? Mark, you seem to know what they're doing, and I would wonder what fraction of the pricing is done by cap and trade, and what fraction of it is done by somehow direct. I don't know what do you call the other system?
It's a carbon tax.
Just carbon tax.
It's a carbon tax. I mean, it's just a straight
Okay.
carbon tax based on the carbon content of the fuel. So it's a very
Now,
straightforward.
but now the Europeans do have a cap and trade. Is that the main thing they're doing, or who gets all the credit?
Well, the thing in the European Union is the extent to which there has been long-term political consensus. That's crucial, that they haven't had the sort of zigzagging that we're seeing in Canada and certain states in the United States too, or Australia. That there's been a long-standing political consensus, principally driven by the Northern Europeans, but that this is what we're doing. And the Germans, you know, are using their financial clout, and the French too, inside the EU to say this is what we're doing. Behind that, you know, there were already, the other problem is they've been at this for a lot longer, that there have been carbon pricing regimes at the national level in Europe since the early 1990s. So they've been at this for 30 years. So this is now deeply embedded into the assumptions of companies. It's embedded into the assumptions of governments about what they're doing. So it's very hard to undo. And now in Europe, you have this very interesting convergence of both climate and security policy because of the events of the last 2 years and a bit, that suddenly getting off fossil fuels in Europe is a security question as well as a climate change question. And there's a happy convergence there that they've learned their lesson. You don't want to be dependent on fossil fuels from anybody, not just Vladimir Putin, because anybody can pull that plug on you and have leverage on you. And so the overall strategy, if you look at the EU energy strategy now, it's about efficiency and renewables, because they've sort of, you know, there's a convergence here. So we're in a very different space in Canada. We're in a very difficult position because the same geopolitical event in Ukraine has produced a situation where our closest allies are parading to our doorstep saying we see you as the geopolitically secure provider of resource commodities and certain types of fossil fuels to replace Russia.
Oh,
And
yeah.
that's a huge problem for Canada. That not only because of course our particularly the fossil fuel part, it's the oil sands and it's liquid natural gas, which is very carbon intensive. It's a huge geopolitical problem for Canada. We're at the opposite end of this conversation because Ursula von der Leyen's turning up on our doorstep, and so Joe Biden, saying we want your fossil fuels and we want your rocks.
Well,
And
it's a
that's a
problem.
problem.
If it might be a problem for the Liberal government, or even certainly would be for any other government if we had one, NDP or something, but I don't think it would be a problem at all for the Conservatives. Sounds like that would make them very happy, wouldn't it?
It would
Yeah.
make them extremely happy. I mean, I don't think, I'll go out on a limb, I don't think our current Conservative Party leadership has actually thought this that far through. Stephen Harper, our previous prime minister, probably would have and seen it that way. But we see this from Madam Freeland. She's very clear in her statements politically that to our allies, come and get it.
Mhm,
You
mhm.
know, we will happily be, Harold Innis would so understand. For those who study political economy, resource exports, that's the role, but it's one that's being embraced by the Canadian federal government very actively. Now, there is a counter embrace. I mean, I'm losing track. It's got to be 50 billion now to the auto manufacturers to make EVs and batteries in Canada is sort of an attempt to counter that and to be in the value-added manufacturing business. But it's a very difficult situation for Canada for the Europeans, it's so much clearer because it's so much, you don't want to be dependent on somebody else as your energy supplier because they've got leverage on you. And the fact that you thought you had leverage on them didn't turn out to work. It's a very, very different dynamic. So that's a long answer, but for the Europeans, it's a convergence of climate policy and security policy. And that
And
works
even,
very, very well.
even in Europe, I mean, clearly there has to be a certain ambivalence about, welcoming oil from the tar sands, if you don't mind the expression. I was talking with Gwyn Dyer, and he talks about Canada being the skunk at the dinner party or something. We have a very bad reputation, and it's very well deserved. So, and I don't know. I'd like to actually ask Art, because I'm not too aware of a debate going on in the US specifically about carbon pricing. Is there anything comparable to the controversy, which I think it is a real controversy now, about carbon taxing in Canada? Are the US taxpayers talking about it in the same way, or how is it viewed? My impression is it may be simply a part of the general discourse on the Republicans disliking government control of anything. So they cut back on the EPA, and they cut back on any government authority that's going to do anything of any value. But tell me what you think, Art.
Well, this is definitely not my area of expertise. I don't really know, but I would say it's not really high on the list of discussion topics in general, sadly. So yeah, I would say it's very under discussed.
My fear is, if Trump comes back, we will notice. There'll be some effects.
My understanding is the US, we had a history, we tried to get a carbon tax. It almost got there, but couldn't get it over the threshold voting. And so the fallback has been we're going to give you carrots instead of sticks. We're going to do this with subsidies, and that's the Inflation Reduction Act, so-called massive subsidies for investment, which seems to be working after, I mean, it is in fact driving major investments in renewable energy in the U.S. In fact, Texas of all places, the largest wind energy producer in the U.S. right now. Or wind and solar, I think it's mostly wind, but
Well, they
so
also
that's
have the
just the
Permian.
history. It's very,
They
very difficult. Yeah.
they also have the Permian Basin, so they're big time producers of all kinds of energy, right?
of yeah.
Texas.
No, I mean, historically, of course. On the things that Mark was talking about, I mean, to his credit, it might be just kind of an election year effort to bring along the environmentalists. He has stopped the permits for gas, natural gas export terminals, liquid, and so. So that's significant because that was one of the part of the effort, I imagine, to help the Europeans. But he, the U.S. I think is it's probably the most difficult country right now, a major developed country to get substantial progress, and the way it's been done is through, as I said, through massive subsidies.
Okay, well, I cut off a whole line of conversation early on because I did want to have this discussion about carbon pricing in particular. But just before we end this thing, I want to open it up enough to ask Mark's opinion, because you did have your own caveats, certainly, if not worse than caveats, about our enthusiasm for geoengineering and our carbon climate repair, I have to learn to say. But that is based presumably on a lingering hope, if not expectation, that using carbon emission reductions one way or another will solve the problem still, that it's still a possibility, and that we are not totally past all hope of being able to solve the thing with the mitigation methods. I want to give you a chance to expound on your point of view about that.
Yeah, I'm going to be very time limited because I only put an hour for us, so I've got to host another meeting at 1:30, so we're a bit stuck. Yeah, I mean, yes, I'm still operating on a notion of hope that we may actually make progress on the mitigation side. Although in a Canadian context, I am obviously increasingly concerned that even what progress we've made is now deeply at risk. And the only thing that's going to be left will be the subsidies that certain industries like. I think that's very clear where Mr. Poilievre is going. Globally, the dynamics are interesting because the Europeans are now, of course, making connections between trade and climate. And they are implementing carbon border adjustments, which I think are pretty big game changers. The problem in to Ron's position, the problem is we are in many ways globally late to this game. And if we'd been doing things 30 years ago, we might be in a very different position. And unfortunately, we haven't gotten serious about climate policy until very recently. That said, for all the reasons I said, I have my doubts about geoengineering. I mean, massive tree planting is one thing. Other things start to cause concerns about how do you assess the risks? How do you establish confidence about what actually is going to happen? How do you build political consensus, and how do you prevent it turning into a point of conflict? Are all things that I would worry about in that context. Is why I've not been terribly keen on the idea, because there's a set of cascading problems that go with it as well. And generally, the underlying principle is that prevention is better and cheaper than cure, and geoengineering is the sort of, it's the cure answer that we failed on prevention. And is it the case that we've hit the failure point on prevention? That's possible, maybe. But then, there's this set of other problems that arise from going down that pathway. I'm gonna have to let Ron Arthur respond to that because I've got to go and host the other meeting.
I don't have much more time, and I want to give Art the last word
Yeah,
because
okay.
Art
Yeah.
has been.
I can delay a minute or two, yeah.
Okay, good. Art, you get the last word.
I would say
Well,
read the paper. That's my response.
Yeah, yes.
Thank you.
Okay.
I just want to say thanks. This was a great learning experience for me. I learned a lot from this. I guess I'm also curious about, there's a third, I guess, category, which is if we're pessimistic, which it sounds like everybody is to some degree, then what are the coping strategies that are, the least expensive, that might be one possible alternative to the geoengineering path, right? And maybe it's in some ways the most realistic in the short term, at least. But
I would refer you to a presentation made by Peter Ward to, I think, the Canadian thing for the, it's like the Club of Rome. It's the people who support the Club of Rome in Canada. And he gave a talk about the cost involved in coping with the rise of the sea. Because as the ice sheets melt in Greenland and Antarctica, and of course the Arctic Ocean, the sea rise could be 15, I won't even try to, he gave big numbers, which would mean that the cost of actually reducing the controlling the land and being able to just keep the water from flooding your house is way more expensive than anything we might do. So that, I think there is an answer to that question, how much various options cost. And we've run out of time. It's certainly gone in several directions, this conversation. And I've learned a little bit about economics from it, and certainly wish you all well for the kinds of, for succeeding with whatever approach you're trying to take. Whatever you think is going to work, go for it. And I'm with everybody on this. So thank you very much, and thanks for participating in this. Okay. Project Save the World produces these forums. Watch them or listen to them as audio podcasts on our website, tosavetheworld.ca. People share information there about 6 global issues, and we welcome your comments too. To find a particular talk show, check the scroll list on the homepage or use the search bar. Project Save the World also produces a quarterly online publication, Peace Magazine, which now serves as a free of charge newsletter to help mobilize knowledge about 6 global threats to humankind. We gladly email the magazine as a PDF or link to any interested organization in the world that works to prevent a global catastrophe involving war and weapons, global warming, famine, pandemics, radioactive contamination, or cyber risks. Just email us at office@peacemagazine.org and we'll add your group's email address without charge to our list. Please type "subscribe my group" as the subject of your email. For individual subscriptions at $20 Canadian per year, go to pressreader.com on your browser and search for Peace Magazine.